The dense, coppery stench of fresh blood completely soaks into the sun-baked sand of an impossibly massive stone arena, instantly swallowed by the deafening, thunderous roar of 50,000 screaming spectators. This is the undisputed center of the known universe, an apex civilization of polished marble, cold iron, and unimaginable, sprawling wealth that dictates the absolute fate of millions with nothing more than a casual, indifferent flick of a ruler's hand. To stand in this hyperdense metropolis is to feel the crushing, undeniable weight of ultimate human authority. Yet beneath this pristine, gleaming veneer of total global supremacy lies a chilling, almost incomprehensible paradox. The greatest geopolitical juggernaut the ancient world would ever witness did not begin with a grand, divine blueprint drawn up by enlightened philosophers, nor was it funded by endless, overflowing vaults of ancestral gold. Let's step back into the blood-soaked shadows of antiquity to witness exactly how a muddy, malaria-ridden swamp inhabited by absolute societal outcasts mutated, decade by decade, into an unstoppable, mechanized hyperstate that would ruthlessly conquer the entire globe. It starts completely in the dirt. 7 rugged, heavily forested hills rising steeply above a meandering, dangerously flood-prone river, a hostile landscape offering absolutely nothing of value except strategic elevation and brutal, constant exposure to violent local warlords. This was definitely not a haven for the civilized or the wealthy. The earliest inhabitants of this rough settlement were outcasts, desperate fugitives, runaway slaves, exiled criminals, and hardened opportunists who had absolutely nothing left to lose and nowhere else to hide. Their raw genesis is deeply soaked in a dark foundation myth of two brothers, a lethal sibling rivalry ending in a sudden act of fratricide, perfectly and morbidly foreshadowing the extreme, unyielding violence that would become their undeniable cultural signature. They did not inherit a refined, highly functioning society. They literally fought tooth and nail, bleeding for every single inch of mud and timber, initially ruled by despotic local kings who treated the populace like expendable cattle. Eventually, the boiling resentment of the populace erupted, violently overthrowing these monarchs to install a radically experimental, highly complex system of government. They called it a republic, a deeply paranoid mechanism of power sharing designed specifically to prevent one single man from ever holding absolute authority again. But make absolutely no mistake, this was no utopian, egalitarian democracy. It was a cold, calculating oligarchy run by ruthless patrician families who inherently understood that bare survival in a hyper-hostile peninsula required one primary, terrifying export: relentless, highly organized military aggression. They forcibly transformed their entire society into a permanent, highly disciplined war camp. Every landowning citizen was fundamentally a soldier first and a farmer second, legally required to instantly drop their plows and pick up heavy wood and leather shields at a moment's notice. The early warfare of this era was unimaginably brutal, fought shoulder to shoulder in claustrophobic, suffocating formations where men slipped blindly on the steaming entrails of their own neighbors. They were not great inventors at first, but rather the ultimate ruthless scavengers of warfare. They absorbed the military technologies of their bitter enemies, stealing chainmail armor designs from northern tribal warriors and reverse engineering complex shipbuilding techniques from their wealthy southern rivals. They were driven by an unyielding, deeply traumatized psychological complex that aggressively dictated they must preemptively conquer absolutely everything around them, simply to guarantee that they would never be subjugated again. To truly understand how this fiercely aggressive, deeply paranoid city-state exploded into a continent-spanning, omnipotent empire, let's tear apart the exact physical mechanics of their most terrifying innovation: the professional military machine. They fundamentally re-engineered the very anatomy of human warfare. Older, rival empires relied heavily on static, impenetrable walls of 30-foot spears, a formation that was heavily armored but tragically slow, completely unable to pivot if suddenly flanked. This rising superpower looked at that archaic military doctrine and entirely scrapped it, inventing a modular, deeply flexible infantry system that operated like a massive swarm of highly lethal, independent cells. Visualize a highly synchronized human meat grinder. The vanguard carried devastatingly heavy javelins, meticulously engineered with soft iron shanks specifically designed to bend violently upon impact. This ingenious flaw rendered the weapon utterly useless to an enemy attempting to throw it back, while simultaneously turning any wooden shield it struck into a massive, dangerously unwieldy burden that had to be immediately discarded. Once a devastating barrage of javelins was unleashed, the heavily armored infantry closed the agonizing, terrifying distance in absolute silence, suddenly drawing short, brutally efficient, double-edged thrusting swords designed specifically for rapid, close-quarters butchery. But their true, horrifying genius lay entirely in their discipline, an industrialized system of psychological conditioning so severe it completely defies modern comprehension. Units that displayed cowardice or broke rank were systematically subjected to a mathematical process where every 10th man was beaten to a bloody pulp by the bare hands of his own comrades. It was a cold, merciless enforcement of absolute loyalty that ensured every single soldier feared the wrath of their commanders far more than any opposing army's weapons. This hyperlethal, perfectly oiled machine allowed them to violently dismantle a colossal, impossibly wealthy maritime superpower across the sea in a series of apocalyptic, decades-long conflicts. They faced a brilliantly tactical phantom of a general who famously crossed ice-choked mountain ranges with armored war beasts, yet they simply absorbed hundreds of thousands of casualties and kept relentlessly marching forward, effectively seizing an absolute, unchallenged monopoly over the entire Mediterranean basin. If you love uncovering the forgotten empires of our past and decoding the ruthless strategies that built them, make sure to subscribe. We unearth stories exactly like this every single week. Returning to the rapidly expanding borders, the sheer, crushing weight of their unprecedented military success began violently tearing apart the fragile political engine that started it all. The Republic's ancient, rigid rules simply could not handle the infinite influx of plundered wealth, millions of newly enslaved humans, and vastly expanded, uncontrollable territories. A brilliantly calculating, dangerously ambitious, and utterly ruthless general eventually realized that the massive, battle-hardened armies were no longer loyal to the abstract concept of the state, but solely to the wealthy commanders who physically paid their wages. By illegally crossing a tiny, strategically insignificant forbidden boundary river with his fiercely loyal legions, he shattered the Republic forever, plunging the entire realm into a catastrophic, incredibly bloody civil war. Out of this apocalyptic ash emerged an autocracy brilliantly disguised as a restored republic, kicking off the imperial era ruled by a succession of absolute monarchs who actively backed their godlike power with mind-bending, monumental engineering. They didn't just conquer foreign land, they physically terraformed the earth to serve their logistics. They constructed tens of thousands of miles of incredibly straight, all-weather highways, utilizing a genius, deeply layered composition of compacted sand, crushed stone, advanced volcanic ash cement, and precisely cut, heavy paving blocks heavily crowned to drain rainwater instantly. To understand the sheer magnitude of this undertaking, compare it to the modern interstate highway system, but executed completely by hand, with men driving iron pickaxes into solid bedrock under the blistering sun. These veins of stone allowed massive legions to march seamlessly across the continent at terrifying speeds, projecting devastating power into the deepest, darkest forests of the known world. Simultaneously, they completely defied gravity by constructing monumental aqueducts, massive, sweeping slopes of stone marching gracefully across entire valleys with a gradient so precisely calculated, dropping mere fractions of an inch over several miles, that they delivered millions of gallons of crystal-clear fresh water straight into the heart of hyperdense urban centers. Yet the very water flowing powerfully through those miraculous aqueducts fed a dark, highly unstable society that the glossy history books rarely choose to illuminate. We are deeply conditioned by cinema to visualize this civilization as a sterile, peaceful utopia of brilliant white marble statues, enlightened philosophical debates in grand public forums, and noble politicians draped in spotless, flowing togas. The raw, unfiltered reality of daily life in the sprawling capital was an absolute waking nightmare of hyperdense urban chaos, suffocating filth, and extreme, staggering economic inequality. The vast, overwhelming majority of the 1 million citizens did not live in sprawling, airy villas. They were desperately crammed into multi-story, shoddily constructed apartment blocks built largely of highly flammable timber and cheap, crumbling mud brick. These towering, structurally unsound structures were absolute death traps. The ground floors constantly housed loud, smoke-filled taverns and continuously burning blacksmith forges, while the cramped upper levels leaned precariously over narrow, sewage-choked alleys. There was absolutely no internal plumbing for the urban poor. Human waste, rotting food, and garbage were routinely dumped directly out of high windows onto the screaming, crowded streets below, aggressively breeding rampant outbreaks of typhus, malaria, and brutal enteric diseases that kept the average life expectancy tragically low. Fires were not a rare, unfortunate tragedy. They were a relentless, daily, terrifying reality. Entire, densely packed neighborhoods would spontaneously combust, leading incredibly wealthy, highly corrupt elites to create the world's first private fire brigades. Utterly ruthless, mafia-like syndicates that would literally force a desperate burning building's owner to sell their entire property at a tiny fraction of its actual value before the crew would finally agree to extinguish the raging flames. Behind the heavy, ornate closed doors of the extravagant imperial palaces, the political reality was equally, if not more, toxic. The grand facade of an enlightened, debating Senate was entirely manipulated by a dark shadow game of silent assassinations, undetectable poisonings, and immense, suffocating paranoia. The ruling emperors lived in constant waking terror of their own elite, heavily armed bodyguards, a highly militarized faction that eventually realized they possessed the ultimate leverage and frequently assassinated reigning monarchs simply to aggressively auction off the throne to the highest available bidder. To aggressively control the starving, desperate, and heavily armed masses, the state engineered the most elaborate, highly effective psychological pacification system in all of human history. They distributed hundreds of thousands of tons of completely free grain to keep bellies just full enough to prevent total, violent rebellion, and paired this welfare with mind-numbing, ultra-violent entertainment. The sprawling arena was never just a venue for sports. It was a highly calculated, vital political tool, a massive pressure valve where the destitute, angry mobs could aggressively project their daily frustrations by watching exotic beasts, wretched prisoners of war, and highly trained combatants slaughter each other in perfectly choreographed, industrial-scale butchery. Beneath this deafening spectacle, an invisible, highly aggressive cancer was quietly devouring the state's very foundation. A severe, unstoppable economic collapse driven directly by chronic intentional currency debasement. Desperate emperors scrambling to quickly pay off the increasingly bloated and demanding military machine quietly began stripping the precious metals from their minted coins, gradually replacing pure silver with incredibly cheap copper. This reckless financial manipulation triggered a catastrophic spiraling hyperinflation. A simple measure of wheat that originally cost a small handful of coins suddenly skyrocketed to cost thousands, effectively vaporizing the entire middle class overnight, destroying vast, complex trade networks, and violently transforming the formerly bustling, advanced economy into a paralyzed, primitive barter system. The ultimate fall of this magnificent, terrifying titan was not a sudden cinematic explosion triggered by a single dramatic barbarian invasion on a Tuesday. It was a prolonged, agonizing, highly complex decay, a slow-motion collapse stretching painfully across several centuries, as the rotting, deeply corrupt internal infrastructure simply could no longer generate the resources to support the vast, violently bloated perimeter of the empire. The military was increasingly, desperately outsourced to foreign tribal mercenaries who felt absolutely zero loyalty to the crumbling capital, while the deeply fractured central government eventually snapped under its own immense bureaucratic gravity, permanently splitting into two drastically different, highly competitive halves. The Western territories slowly dissolved into a deeply fractured patchwork of isolated, warring kingdoms, plunging the continent into a brutal era of severe technological regression, forgotten engineering, and profound geopolitical isolation. Yet the absolute, undeniable genius of their civilization was that it stubbornly refused to completely die. The raw, complex code of their society embedded itself deeply and permanently into the very DNA of human history. The meticulous, highly advanced legal frameworks they developed to carefully manage global trade, establish property rights, and enforce contracts formed the absolute foundational blueprints for the justice systems of nearly every single modern Western nation today. The hyperdurable concrete they invented, utilizing a highly unique, specific mixture of volcanic ash and seawater that actively strengthened and repaired itself over thousands of years, remains an absolute chemical marvel that modern material scientists are only just now beginning to fully decode and desperately replicate. The grand architectural language of their colossal, spanning domes, soaring, sweeping arches, and massive, intimidating basilicas became the undisputed universal template for projecting power, copied endlessly by later empires, modern democratic republics, and colossal financial institutions attempting to visually project an aura of unwavering, eternal authority. They proved unequivocally that staggering human ambition, when deeply paired with relentless, highly mechanized organization and absolute, ruthless pragmatism, could violently bend the natural world and millions of individual human lives to its absolute, unyielding will. As we quietly look upon the fractured, moss-covered ruins of their once impenetrable defensive walls and the silent, towering, broken arches of their shattered aqueducts, we are forcefully made to confront a deeply unsettling, intensely powerful mirror. They truly believed their sprawling empire was entirely eternal, an invincible, gleaming apex of human achievement entirely immune to the forces of collapse. Yet they were ultimately completely consumed by the very same greed, extreme political polarization, and endless, exhausting military expansion that originally built them. Their silent, towering ghosts serve as a permanent, chillingly relevant warning to every single modern superpower that dares to ambitiously rise in their massive wake. If exploring the darkest, most incredibly fascinating corners of human history and uncovering the hidden mechanical forces that heavily built our modern world captivates you, hit that subscribe button to instantly join our rapidly growing community of curious minds. We aggressively decode the deeply complex past to better understand the rapidly approaching future, and the very next journey is already beginning.